Hi, and welcome. My name is Kylie Fuentes, and I'm currently a VP of Product over at Salesforce, where I oversee the Revenue Cloud product line. Thank you so much for choosing to join me today. Let's just say there's a lot going on right now, and your time is your most valuable asset, so I appreciate you giving me some of it. I'm in San Francisco, but I'd love to know where you're all joining from today. Shout out in the comments section, share with one another, and let's try and make this as interactive as possible. So today, I'm going to spend some time with you sharing my thoughts on how we might, just might, be able to see a silver lining as we look beyond the pandemic. Now, I don't know about you, but to me at least, this image feels like a million lifetimes away. All those naive people gathering together in close proximity, celebrating 2020 like it was going to be the bee's knees. Little did they know. Clearly, the plan went more than a little sideways. Instead, we had a year with a multitude of crises at scales that I think even now we're unable to properly understand. Health, economic, and social emergencies have been a constant in our lives for months and months on end. And while we don't exactly know how, I think we do know that things have changed forever. Does anyone recognize this by any chance? Do you want to write it in there and let us know? Yeah. Well, actually, it's the Chinese symbol for crisis. And it's often said, mistakenly by JFK, I believe, actually, that it's the composition of two characters. One for the word danger and the other for the word opportunity. Well, it turns out that that's not exactly correct, if we want to be precise. In reality, it's more like the characters for the word danger and incipient point, or the precise moment when things begin to change. Either way, I think it's really relevant. The point being that in times of crisis, there are also opportunities for paradigm shifts. A lot of the discussion about how the pandemic has impacted our work lives, and our whole lives really for that matter, I think centers on kind of the front and center, the things that are kind of pretty obvious. And in the case of work, that's really meant we're talking about we're spending less time in the office and we're spending more time at home and all of the consequences of that in our daily lives. But I'm really interested in what happens as a result of that. The consequences downstream, or the sort of secondary consequences that we might see down the line. And in particular, how that might impact on diversity in tech. So before we get too deep into this, I need to be fully disclosing to you that I am not an economist, nor am I an expert in diversity and inclusion. But I am deeply interested in this topic because in some ways I see a little of my own journey reflected. How many of you are scratching your head wondering where my accent's from? I bet you there's more than one of you because I always get asked the question and people never get it right usually. So I bet you probably wouldn't guess that I'm a Spaniard. And that's because I grew up bouncing between Spain and Australia. And so I'm sort of but from both of those countries. My mother's actually Irish, so I'm just from all over the map. Now, I might be biased. I've lived in some of the most spectacular waterfront cities on earth, as these pictures clearly show. Anyway. Back to a little bit more about my career journey. So for the historians on the call, yes, that's an original iPhone. I'm dating myself a little now, but I started my product career in telco before that revolutionary device had hit the market. And for any of you who know the Australian market, they are extremely early adopters of mobile tech. There was so much frenzy for this device as it was hitting the market. Now, at that point in time, most mobile product managers were actually hardware product managers. But when the iPhone came along, that just dramatically shifted things. All of a sudden, I needed to learn the software world, and I was doing that at 100 miles an hour. That crazy pivot in my career became the trajectory for me to move into roles across e-commerce, retail tech, marketplaces, and SaaS. Along the way, I've been fortunate to build and lead incredible teams in many different locations. Now, as a Hispanic person in tech, a woman, no less, I have found myself doing some introspection on how I got to where I am now and why, perhaps, the road has been somewhat easier for me than some others. I absolutely appreciate that I, relative to many, have lots of privileges. But there was one thought that kind of bounced around in my mind a little more than others. To what extent did the flexibility I had in geographical location play a role in my success? And then, if it did play a role, how might that, more importantly, impact on the opportunity creation for other women or people in minority groups? So, as a product person, I fundamentally believe that diversity drives better product outcomes. There are just so many examples where bad products make it to market because they were designed with a single perspective in mind. Embarrassingly, I'm geekishly into my VR headset. It's how I connect with my brother back in Spain. But I'm always getting nauseous 10 minutes in, whereas he can keep going for hours and hours. It turns out there's growing evidence that women are much more likely to get VR sickness than men, which is due to a number of product design choices. And then there are the challenges with facial recognition software, which in some cases is falsely identifying Black and Asian people up to 100 times more than their Caucasian counterparts. And of course, the huge concerns which are emerging around bias in AI algorithms, which are deeply embedded in products that are there to guide societal aspects like jail sentencing. No matter which way you look at it, we need more people from more backgrounds building tomorrow's innovations. To work out how far we need to go, we need to stop and look at where we are. And it's safe to say we haven't made as much progress as we would have liked. It's actually a little tricky to get industry-wide standardized data. But in 2014, some of the big tech companies commenced reporting out publicly on their diversity statistics. And given they're big employers in the sector, it's probably a fairly good proxy for what's going on more broadly. This is a big deal because, as any PM worth their salt knows, you can't improve what you don't measure. The results were disheartening. Black, Latino, and Native people were starkly underrepresented. Now, since then, these companies and many others more have spun up diversity divisions, invested millions in all sorts of programs for their employees and changed their recruitment programs, etc. And they've made considerable efforts to try and change the situation. But I think telling of how big the challenge really is that 5 years, 6 years later, and the results have really hardly shifted. And when it comes to women, depending on the source you look at, we account for about 25% of all jobs in computing, which is a clear shortfall from our representation in the total workforce population. And what these numbers don't show is how dire the situation gets the more you move up the management chain. For Blacks, Latinos, and women, and especially women of color, the numbers just dwindle dramatically. Now, these statistics, I'm sure, are not new to you, and neither is the dialogue around why. When we try to understand the reasons why we haven't seen the shifts in some of these numbers, there are oftentimes 3 key topics that rear their head on the table. The first and the most obvious is the pipeline. How do we actually fill roles with people from underrepresented groups if they're just not applying? The second is what was referred to by Frida Kapoor-Klein, who is a founding partner at venture capital firm Kapoor Capital, as the denominator problem. Now, to explain that a little bit, When you're a company that is growing and scaling rapidly, and keep in mind that some of these big guys as much as quadrupled their workforce in 5 years, you would have to hire thousands of people from minority groups just to maintain your historical diversity rates. Now, think about what it would take to improve upon that baseline. You would have to hire exponentially more again. And that just seems really difficult given the pipeline conversation that we just had. Finally, hiring is really only the first step. At the end of the day, you need to stop the leaking bucket. And sadly, both women and people of color don't stay in tech roles as much as their colleagues. For instance, one recent study, which was done by Accenture and Girls Who Code, showed that 50% of women who go into tech jobs end up leaving before they turn 35. So that's the gritty truth of where we are today. But now the question is, well, what about geography? How does location come into play as a factor influencing diversity? Well, I work in enterprise tech, and one thing I can tell you from our customers is that pretty much every business is a digital business these days. And COVID has made that absolutely clear. How we define tech is no longer concentrated in tech companies. Engineers, designers, product managers, and all tech functions can be found across all industries and across all countries. Actually, I'd love to hear from you. Shout out for anyone here who doesn't work in a traditional company, tech company. It'd be awesome to kind of hear a little bit about that. What's mind-blowing to me, however, is that in the US alone, virtually all growth in tech employment can be traced back to just 5 cities: San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, Boston, and San Diego. Turns out that opportunity isn't geographically spread. In fact, it's hyper-concentrated. And that's just one dimension. Consider that today only 10% of Americans will relocate for a job. That number used to be around 40% back in 1980. And when you probe for insights as to why there is so much reluctance to relocate, one factor stands out above all others. It's really, really expensive. To pick up and move home and leave your social network and support networks behind not only takes big guts, it also takes big bucks. And unfortunately, that is something that is out of reach of many, especially for people of color. According to the Census Bureau, Black households have a median household income of about $45,500-ish, Latino households about $56,000, and compare that with white households who are sitting at above $72,000. Now, when we overlay those cities before, remember, the ones who had the highest growth in tech sector employment, against the US cities who have the highest cost of living, well, the picture is pretty stark. They're the same ones. It is unsurprising then that sourcing diverse talent from beyond the confines of the office commute boundary is just difficult. The very location of these jobs has an inbuilt barrier to diversity before you've even started to recruit. And that's at the macro level. But location also matters at the micro scale. So even if you get to these cities, there are still hard choices to make. Most people, when choosing where to live, will need to evaluate factors such as price, space, convenience. Now, tech culture is known for being fast-paced and fairly demanding, and many people, as a result, choose to live close to work for convenience. Now, if it's too expensive to do on your own, many opt to room share with others. Cue many a Silicon Valley or tech sitcom. Now, for those though who have families or are considering them, the need for space and the sky-high prices of downtown housing will often result in a trade-off on convenience. Commute times become really long and add to an already long working day. which means there's a high personal cost, taking time away from family, friends, and building a life outside of work. Now think back, when we talked about those barriers which have been holding back our shifts in some of the numbers we saw, pipeline, the denominator problem, and attrition. Well, now we know, thanks to the geographical location of a job, we're inherently going to come up against challenges in changing the profile of our pipeline. And the other problem with pipelines is that in tech, nearly 40% of jobs end up coming through referrals. We refer people from our friends and family network usually, which means we're pulling oftentimes from the same demographics, the same experience set, and oftentimes the same geographical pool. We end up hiring and referring people who look a lot like us. The second factor was about overcoming the notion of the denominator problem, right? Well, we need to find a way to exponentially scale our diversity hires. Relying on the diverse talent pool in the local market or pulling from local feeder universities is just not going to be enough to change the index. To make a significant impact, we need so many diverse hires that we'll have to broaden the search well beyond the population available in commute zones. Now, on attrition. This is a complex theme with many facets to explore, and to be honest, we're not going to do justice to them all here. But there is a location factor that I want us to consider. The demands of high-tech working culture and the realities of long days, long commute times, and inflexibility in our work schedule puts an extra toll on women. Now, clearly not every household is the same, but in general, statistics show that women bear the heaviest share of household responsibilities. And so the lack of work-life balance is actually one of the biggest culprits behind the high attrition rate amongst women in tech. So here we are. Our tech industry is a tightly bound bubble. We want to be more diverse, but we hire only from certain geographical pools, and there's just not enough diverse talent within those locations to change the status quo. What we really need is something to come along that forces some structural change. And Q, this is maybe where, just maybe, the disaster that was 2020, 2021 might have a silver lining. Every once in a while, the world is rocked by events that change its orbit just slightly. The Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression of the 20s, the invention of the internet, the global financial crisis, and enter COVID-19. In early 2020, pretty much all tech workers were abruptly told to go home and work from there. Clearly, we were not prepared, neither employers or employees. But somehow we had to make it work. First, it looked like it would be for a few days, then a few weeks, and here we are, closing in on nearly a year later, and we still don't really have an end in sight. Now, for many people, this overnight shift was not easy. Their homes were not set up to be offices, and I'm sure you've all seen images like this one, which I love, people who were getting extremely creative just to make do. And of course, this doesn't even cover the breadth of other issues people had to deal with, like juggling homeschooling or childcare, or not having adequate space for more than one person in the household to work from home. I've literally heard stories of people who were making phone calls for meetings from their bathroom because it was the only quiet place in the house. Several months in, and employees started to ask themselves, why stay in a high-priced city when I can't even take advantage of any of its benefits? The lure of more space, lower rents, and the ability to be out of the urban and closer to nature became too enticing. Do we have any San Francisco people on the call? Shout out, say hi, let us know. So for those of you who know, there's always been a talk of San Francisco having an exodus, but this time it might just be real. Rents are down 27% year on year, and many buildings are at less than 40% occupancy. You absolutely could argue that this is just temporary and that these workers will be back once the pandemic is done. Except that companies themselves are also shifting their operating models. COVID has become an overnight experiment on how distributed work can operate at scale. And to everyone's surprise, generally speaking, productivity and results haven't adversely been impacted. So it seems like every other week, we are now hearing of another big name tech company announcing their future plans for a distributed workforce or moving their HQ from one of the big tech centers to other less obvious locations. And this is where the opportunity presents itself for diversity. If companies are preparing for a distributed first work culture, this means that future job openings no longer need to be geographically bound. And this is great news on the diversity front, both on the pipeline perspective and on attrition. By broadening the geographical search parameters, we can exponentially grow our talent pools. We could also establish relationships with other new feeder universities that we perhaps don't have relationships with today. And the one I'm possibly most excited about is that we might be able to change up the profiles of our referral networks. Why? Well, because the more diverse talent we start to recruit, especially from other geographies, there's a better chance that they themselves will start to refer others that look more like them and less than our status quo. How many of you here, just out of interest, would opt to work from home at least some of the time if given the option? So you can probably see it's a little hard to predict exactly what employees are going to do post-COVID when given the choice. And those numbers are in a little bit of a state of flux. At the beginning of the pandemic, for instance, many people said that they wanted to work from home permanently or could see themselves doing that at least semi-permanently when they return to, I guess, normal. However, as time has gone on and patience has run short, the proportion of people who say they want to get back to the office has steadily gone up. But I think it's important to remember that working from home or working from a co-working space in your favorite coastal town is not to be confused, because it is not the same thing, as working from home in the middle of a raging pandemic. These are not normal times. Most experts agree, regardless on the exact figure, the percentage of workers who are not in the office on a full-time basis will significantly shift in a post-COVID world. And really, that means it's going to be more about giving employees options rather than mandates, which inherently is all about flexibility and choice. And I think that is good news for all of us. Sounds like a nirvana, doesn't it? But not so fast. Even if the environment is ripe for these kinds of changes, it does not mean we are automatically, magically going to unlock them. Leaders in tech are going to play a critical role. And in particular, we need to seize the opportunity with diversity in mind. We need to proactively be open to hiring from other geographies. We should seek out other feeder universities, and we should encourage referrals from our diverse hires. And these are just to name a few, and of course sit above and beyond all of the things that we need to do to improve our hiring practices for diversity. And remember, it's not all about the pipeline, right? The key to employee retention, and therefore preventing attrition, is employee satisfaction. And that means changing our workplace culture to be more inclusive of remote workers. Practices like asynchronous communications where possible, instead of a meeting-heavy culture, can really help. One of the big challenges for career progression with remote workers is getting exposure or visibility. If you're a product leader and you oversee distributed teams, make sure you create space for your remote team members so that they can be seen and heard by you, other leaders, and their peers. Give them a platform to build their own personal brand and to get acknowledgement for their achievements. We also need to make sure that employees are set up for success. How will we do things like offset the informal interactions at the water cooler? How will we create space for human connection, relationship building, and brainstorming? And critically, how will we make sure employees have the infrastructure they need to work comfortably from outside of the office environment? And yes, that means we can't take for granted that everybody has fast, high-speed internet at home. There really isn't, I think, a great playbook for what we're about to encounter. It's a new world, and you know what? There are many things ahead of us to learn. However, there are already some great examples out there of companies who are trying great things and have had some good success. So from what I'm seeing so far, I'm really encouraged about what's to come. Thank you for joining. I hope this has given you some food for thought. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon.